You are listening to HOA Consequences. She tried to fine me for weather. You cannot park that truck on this street during snow emergency hours. Janice yells at me, her breath fogging between us, and I am holding a service invoice packet while my rideshare pickup watches from his car with the hazards blinking. The fine is $200 per day, retroactive to last Tuesday, and I am going to have your vehicle towed if you do not move it right now. I look at her portable thermal printer already spitting out a notice, and I know this is going to be a long winter. My name is Ryan. I am 32, and I moved to Boston 3 years ago for a steady irrigation tech job with a landscaping company that does commercial and residential work year-round. Cedar Frost HOA Incorporated is a development in West Roxbury, where the committee micromanages shoveling like it is architecture. And I bought a townhouse here because the mortgage was cheaper than my old rent, and the commute was shorter. The HOA runs a snow compliance hotline that Janice Baker controls. And she is the pool and amenities chair who treats access like a bouncer controls a velvet rope. The stakes for me are simple. I am trying to keep peace with neighbors, and the HOA is turning everyone against me because Janice decided my replacement mailbox post is the wrong style, and my snow piles are too close to the curb. The trouble started 2 weeks ago when I installed a new mailbox post after the old one rotted through. I used a standard 4x4 treated post and a black metal box that matched the neighborhood. But Janice showed up the next morning with a snowblower manual and told me the post was not compliant with the design guidelines, and my snowblower model was banned under some clause she invented. I told her the post was identical to 6 others on my street, and she said, "Keep talking. I love adding notes." Then she took a photo of my driveway with her phone, walked to the edge of my property line, and took another photo from an angle that made my snow pile look like it was blocking the sidewalk when it was actually 3 feet inside my lot line. That afternoon, I got an email from the management company with a violation notice citing unauthorized exterior modification and improper snow storage, creating a pedestrian hazard. The fine schedule started at $50 and doubled every week. I called the management company and asked for specifics, and the rep told me Janice had submitted a formal complaint with time-stamped photos and a written statement. I asked to see the design guidelines, and she sent me a PDF that was 23 pages of vague language about maintaining curb appeal and seasonal maintenance standards. There was nothing about mailbox posts or snowblower brands. I spent that evening reading the Massachusetts Homeowners Association Act and the city snow removal ordinances, and I found something interesting. The City Code Enforcement Office has jurisdiction over pedestrian access and emergency vehicle clearance, not the HOA. If Janice wanted to claim my snow pile was a hazard, she needed a city inspector to confirm it, and the HOA had no authority to levy fines for something the city had not cited. I saved that statute citation as a PDF and printed 2 copies. I also texted my friend Luis, a local paralegal who helps me organize evidence packets for small claims cases, and he told me to document everything and keep a timeline. The next morning, I shoveled my driveway, the sidewalk in front of my house, and the walkway to my mailbox. I used a measuring tape to confirm the snow pile was 4 feet from the curb and entirely on my property, and I took photos from 4 angles with timestamps. I was finishing when Janice walked up with her thermal printer and told me the pile was still too high and I needed to haul the snow off-site or face escalating fines. I asked her to show me the rule, and she said it was common sense, and the board had given her discretion to enforce winter safety standards. I told her I would wait for a written violation with a specific rule citation, and she said, "Make it public. I love watching people get embarrassed." That was the boomerang line, and I gave her a small thank you internally, because she just handed me leverage, If she wanted to make this public, I had screenshots and measurements ready to go. But I did not say that out loud. I just nodded and went inside. 2 days later, the HOA plow crew came through and pushed a fresh berm of packed snow and ice back into the bottom of my driveway. It was deliberate. Every other driveway on the block had a clean apron, but mine had a 3-foot wall of frozen slush blocking my garage. I spent an hour with a shovel and a metal scraper breaking it up, and I took more photos. The plow came back the next morning and did it again. I called the management company and filed a complaint, and the rep told me the plow contractor was hired by the HOA and followed board-approved routes. I asked if the board-approved route included blocking driveways, and she said she would pass my concern along. That same afternoon, Janice showed up again, this time with a man in a reflective vest who introduced himself as the tow vendor the HOA contracts with. He walked around my truck, which was parked legally in my driveway, and told me it was overhanging the sidewalk by 2 inches, and the HOA had authorized him to place a tow warning sticker on the windshield if it was not moved within 24 hours. I measured the overhang with my tape measure and confirmed it was 0 inches, and I told him I would file a harassment complaint if he touched my vehicle. Janice stood behind him with her arms crossed and said the HOA had a zero-tolerance policy for obstruction during snow emergencies, and my truck was creating a liability. I asked her to define snow emergency, and she said the board would decide that on a case-by-case basis. I took more photos, including the tow vendor's truck with the company name visible and Janice standing next to it. Then I went inside and called Luis. He told me to file a police report for harassment and to request an incident number, because that would create an official record I could use later. I drove to the West Roxbury police station and spoke to an officer at the front desk. I explained the situation, showed him the photos and the violation notices, and he took a report. He gave me an incident number and told me the HOA could not authorize a tow from a private driveway without a court order or a proven safety violation, and if the tow vendor came back, I should call 911. I thanked him and saved the incident number in my phone. That weekend, I got another email from the management company. This one had an attached PDF with 6 pages of violations, all dated within the past 10 days. Unauthorized mailbox post, improper snow storage, vehicle obstruction, failure to maintain clear pedestrian access, use of non-compliant snow removal equipment, and creation of ice hazards due to inadequate draina. The total fines added up to $850, and the email said the HOA board would hold a hearing in 2 weeks to determine if additional penalties were warranted. The email also said I was required to submit a written response within 5 business days, or the violations would be considered admitted. I forwarded the email to Luis and asked him to help me organize a response. He came over that evening with his laptop and a 3-ring binder, and we went through every violation line by line. For the mailbox post, we printed photos of 6 other identical posts on my street and highlighted the section of the design guidelines that said posts must be natural wood or metal, which mine was. For the snow storage, we printed my measurements and the city ordinance that said snow piles must be at least 3 feet from the curb on private property, which mine were. For the vehicle obstruction, we printed the police report and photos showing 0 overhang. For the snow removal equipment, we printed the manufacturer's specs for my snowblower and confirmed there was no mention of banned models anywhere in the HOA rules. For the ice hazards, we printed weather records showing the temperature had not risen above freezing in 6 days. So any ice formation was due to natural conditions, not my drainage. Luis also pulled the call logs from the tow vendor using a public records request, and we found something interesting. Janice had called the tow company 11 times in the past month, and 8 of those calls were during evening hours, not business hours. The vendor had responded to my address twice, both times without a valid tow authorization from the city or a court. Luis said that pattern suggested a cozy relationship, and if we could prove Janice was using the tow vendor to harass homeowners, it would undermine her credibility with the board. I submitted my written response to the management company 3 days later. It was 12 pages with photos, measurements, statute citations, the police incident number, and a timeline showing the coordinated harassment pattern. I also included a cover letter requesting the board dismiss all violations and issue a written retraction, and I CC'd Luis as my representative. The management company acknowledged receipt, but did not respond to the substance. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at the community clubhouse, which Janice controlled as the amenities chair. I arrived 15 minutes early with Luis, and we found the room set up like a courtroom. A long table at the front for the board, a single chair facing them for me, and rows of folding chairs for spectators. About 20 neighbors were already there, and I recognized most of them from block parties and summer cookouts. Janice was sitting at the board table with 4 other members, and she had her thermal printer on the table in front of her, along with a 3-inch binder. The board president, a retired accountant named Walter, called the meeting to order and read the violation summary. He asked me if I had anything to say, and I stood up and handed him my response packet. I also handed copies to the other board members and kept one for myself. I said I disputed all 6 violations. The evidence showed I was in full compliance with HOA rules and city ordinances, and the harassment pattern suggested the violations were pretextual. Walter flipped through the packet and asked Janice if she wanted to respond. Janice opened her binder and pulled out a new set of photos. She said the photos were taken that morning and showed my snow pile had grown since the original complaint, and my truck was now parked in a red zone during a declared snow emergency. She passed the photos to Walter, and I asked to see them. The photos were staged. One showed my snow pile from an angle that made it look like it was spilling onto the sidewalk. But the perspective was distorted, and you could see the edge of her boot in the corner of the frame, meaning she had stepped onto my property to take it. The other photo showed my truck parked in my driveway with an orange cone placed 2 feet in front of the bumper, as if the cone marked a no parking zone, but there was no red curb and no city signage. I stood up and said the photos were misleading and possibly trespassing, and I had time-stamped photos from that same morning showing the snow pile was unchanged and no cone was present. I pulled out my phone and showed Walter the metadata, and he frowned. I also said the HOA had not declared a snow emergency in any official communication, and the city had not issued one either, so the red zone claim was fabricated. Janice said the board had the authority to declare emergencies as needed, and I said that authority was not in the governing documents and contradicted city jurisdiction. Walter asked the board attorney, who was sitting in the back row, if the HOA could declare a snow emergency without city coordination. The attorney, a woman in her 50s with a tired expression, said the HOA could adopt emergency policies, but those policies had to be consistent with state and local law, and any enforcement action had to follow due process. She also said fines could not be imposed retroactively without prior notice of the rule. Walter looked at Janice and asked if she had notified homeowners of the snow emergency policy before issuing violations. Janice said the policy was common sense, and homeowners were expected to use reasonable judgment. The attorney shook her head and said that was not sufficient notice under Massachusetts law. Walter sighed and said the board would take the matter under advisement and issue a decision within 10 business days. I thanked him and left with Luis. On the way out, I heard Janice say to another board member, "Keep talking, I love adding notes," and I knew she was not done. The next morning, I woke up to find a tow sticker on my windshield. It was printed on bright yellow paper with bold letters that said, "Violation notice. Authorized tow in 24 hours. Do not move this vehicle." I took a photo of the sticker with my phone, then peeled it off and saved it in a plastic bag. I called the police non-emergency line and asked for an officer to come document the sticker, and a patrol car showed up 20 minutes later. The officer took photos, wrote a report, and gave me a second incident number. He said the sticker was not issued by the city or a legitimate towing authority, and if the vehicle was towed, I should call 911 immediately and report it as theft. I also called the tow vendor and asked to speak to the owner. A man with a gruff voice answered and said he did not have any active tow orders for my address. I told him someone had placed a sticker on my windshield claiming to be from his company, and he said he would look into it. I gave him my address and the incident number, and he said he would call me back. He did not call back. That afternoon, I got a call from the management company. The rep said the board had reviewed my response and Janice's rebuttal, and they were scheduling a follow-up hearing for the next week. She also said the board was considering additional penalties for obstruction and failure to cooperate, and I should be prepared to address those allegations. I asked what obstruction meant, and she said Janice had filed a supplemental complaint alleging I had interfered with the tow vendor and threatened legal action against board members. I told her that was false. I had only called the police to document harassment, and I had every right to consult an attorney. She said she was just relaying the message and hung up. I called Luis and told him about the new allegations. He said the board was doubling down and we needed to escalate our evidence. He suggested we file a formal complaint with the Massachusetts Attorney General's office alleging HOA misconduct and request an investigation. He also suggested we send a demand letter to the board attorney outlining the harassment pattern and the call logs, and threatened to file a civil suit for intentional infliction of emotional distress if the violations were not dismissed. I agreed, and Luis drafted both documents that evening. The demand letter was 3 pages and included a summary of the harassment timeline, the staged photos, the tow vendor relationship, the police incident numbers, and the statute citation showing the HOA had no authority over snow pile placement on private property. The letter demanded the board dismiss all violations, issue a written retraction, and remove Janice from any enforcement role, pending an investigation. It also said I was reserving the right to pursue damages for emotional distress, lost time, and reputational harm if the board did not comply within 10 business days. Luis sent the letter via certified mail to the board attorney, the management company, and all 5 board members. The Attorney General complaint was shorter but more formal. It alleged the HOA was operating a snow compliance hotline without proper oversight, levying fines without due process, and using a tow vendor to harass homeowners in coordination with a board member. It requested an investigation and a public hearing. Luis filed it online and forwarded me the confirmation number. If you are enjoying this HOA chaos, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where the Karen gets what she deserves. The follow-up hearing was scheduled for the next Tuesday, but 2 days before, I got a call from the board attorney. She said she had reviewed my demand letter and the evidence packet, and she wanted to discuss a resolution. I told her I was willing to listen, and she said the board was prepared to dismiss the mailbox post violation and the snowblower violation, but they wanted me to agree to move my snow pile another 2 feet from the curb. and to park my truck in the garage during any future snow events. I said I would not agree to those terms because my snow pile was already compliant with city code and my truck was legally parked in my driveway. I also said the HOA had no authority to impose parking restrictions on private driveways, and if the board wanted to enforce snow emergency policies, they needed to adopt them through the proper process and notify all homeowners in advance. The attorney paused and said she understood my position, but the board was concerned about liability and wanted to avoid further conflict. I said the best way to avoid conflict was to dismiss all violations, retract the fines, and address the harassment pattern. She said she would relay that to the board and call me back. She did not call back. The hearing went forward as scheduled. This time, the room was packed. At least 40 neighbors showed up, and several of them came up to me before the meeting and said they had received similar violations from Janice over the past year. One woman said Janice had fined her for leaving a recycling bin on the curb 2 hours past pickup time. A man said Janice had threatened to tow his car because it was parked in a guest spot overnight. A couple said Janice had cited them for having a wreath on their door in January because it was not a designated holiday decoration period. I took notes and asked if they would be willing to speak during the public comment section. They all said yes. Walter called the meeting to order and asked me to present my case. I stood up and summarized my response packet, emphasizing the police incident numbers, the call logs showing Janice's relationship with the tow vendor, and the statute citation showing the HOA had no authority over snow placement on private property. I also introduced Luis as my representative and asked him to address the procedural violations. Luis stood up and explained that the HOA had imposed fines without proper notice, had failed to adopt emergency policies through the required process, and had allowed a board member to use her position to harass a homeowner. He said those actions violated the Massachusetts Homeowners Association Act and exposed the board to personal liability. Janice interrupted and said I was wasting everyone's time and trying to intimidate the board with legal threats. She said the violations were legitimate, the photos were accurate, and the board had a duty to enforce the rules. I said the photos were staged and I had proof, and I pulled out my phone and showed Walter the metadata again. I also said I had witnesses who could testify to a pattern of selective enforcement, and I asked Walter if he would allow public comment. Walter looked at the attorney, who nodded. He opened the floor, and 7 neighbors stood up and spoke. Each one described a similar experience. Janice had issued violations for minor or fabricated infractions, had threatened towing or fines, and had refused to provide rule citations or due process. One man said Janice had called the tow vendor to his house at 10 at night and woken up his kids. A woman said Janice had told her the HOA could revoke her pool access if she did not pay a fine for a holiday decoration. Another man said Janice had taken photos of his property from inside his backyard without permission. By the time the last person finished, Janice was red-faced and silent. Walter asked Janice if she wanted to respond. She stood up and said the complaints were coordinated, and I had organized a smear campaign against her. She said she was only doing her job, and the board had given her discretion to enforce the rules. Walter asked her if she had documentation showing the board had authorized her to issue violations without rule citations or due process. She said the authorization was implicit in her role as amenities chair. The attorney shook her head and said implicit authorization was not sufficient under the governing documents. Walter said the board would take a 10-minute recess to confer in private. I sat down with Luis, and he said the momentum had shifted. The neighbors had corroborated my timeline, and the attorney had clearly signaled that the board was on thin ice. I said I hoped Walter would do the right thing, but I was not holding my breath. When the board came back, Walter said they had reviewed the evidence and the public comments, and they had decided to dismiss 4 of the 6 violations: the mailbox post, the snowblower, the vehicle obstruction, and the ice hazards. He said they were upholding the snow storage violation and the failure to cooperate violation, and the fines would be reduced to $100 total. He said I could appeal the decision to the full membership at the annual meeting, which was 3 months away. I stood up and said I did not accept the decision. I said the snow storage violation was based on staged photos and contradicted city code, and the failure to cooperate violation was retaliation for exercising my legal rights. I said I would file an appeal, and I would also pursue the Attorney General complaint and the civil suit if the board did not dismiss all violations and issue a written retraction. Walter said that was my prerogative, and the meeting was adjourned. I left the clubhouse with Luis, and we sat in my truck for a few minutes debriefing. He said the board had made a tactical mistake by upholding any violations after the public testimony, and the attorney would likely advise them to settle before the appeal. I said I hoped so, but I was not counting on it. Then I remembered the trump card I had been holding, and I told Luis it was time to deploy it. The trump card was a city code enforcement confirmation I had requested 3 weeks earlier, right after Janice issued the first violation. I had called the Boston Inspectional Services Department and asked for a written determination on whether the HOA had authority to enforce snow placement rules on private property. The inspector had come out, measured my snow pile, reviewed the city ordinance, and issued a letter confirming that my snow storage was compliant with city code and the HOA had no jurisdiction over the issue. The letter also said that any HOA fines related to snow placement were unenforceable and could not be recorded as liens. I had kept the letter in reserve because I wanted to see how far the board would go, and now I had my answer. I scanned the letter and emailed it to the board attorney with a cover note saying I was submitting the packet to the HOA attorney and I expected the tone to change instantly. I CC'd Walter and the management company. Then I waited. The attorney called me the next morning. She said she had reviewed the city letter and she agreed it was dispositive. She said the board would meet in emergency session that evening, and she expected they would vote to dismiss all violations and issue a written retraction. She also said the board was considering disciplinary action against Janice for exceeding her authority and creating liability for the association. I thanked her and said I looked forward to receiving the written retraction. The emergency session was not open to the public, but Walter called me the next day and said the board had voted 4-1 to dismiss all violations, retract the fines, and issue a formal apology. He said Janice had voted against the motion and had accused the board of caving to legal threats. He also said the board had voted to remove Janice from the amenities chair position and to prohibit her from issuing violations or contacting homeowners outside of official meetings. He said the board attorney would send me the written retraction and the meeting minutes within 5 business days. I received the retraction a week later. It was a 1-page letter on HOA letterhead, signed by Walter, stating that all violations issued to me between December and January were dismissed, the fines were voided, and the HOA acknowledged that my snow storage and mailbox post were compliant with all applicable rules and ordinances. The letter also included a statute citation read into the minutes that shuts the threat down, specifically citing the City Code Enforcement Letter and the Massachusetts Homeowners Association Act section on due process. The meeting minutes arrived a few days later, and they included the full vote count and a summary of the board's discussion. The minutes noted that Janice had objected to the dismissal and had stated on the record that the board was setting a dangerous precedent by allowing homeowners to challenge enforcement actions. The minutes also noted that Janice had refused to return the thermal printer and the snowblower manual, both of which were HOA property, and the board had authorized the management company to retrieve them. The final section of the minutes included a formal censure of Janice for exceeding her authority, creating liability for the association, and engaging in a pattern of harassment against multiple homeowners. The censure stripped her of all committee assignments and banned her from contacting homeowners outside of official meetings. I forwarded the retraction and the minutes to Luis, and he said it was a clean win. He also said the Attorney General complaint would likely be closed now that the HOA had taken corrective action, but we could request a follow-up investigation if Janice retaliated. I said I would keep the file open just in case. The next week, I ran into Janice at the neighborhood gate. I was coming back from a service call, and she was standing at the frozen keypad with a line of cars behind her, trying to punch in the code. Her hands were shaking, and she dropped her phone twice. I pulled up behind her and waited. She finally got the gate open and drove through, and as she passed my truck, she glared at me and mouthed something I could not hear. I just waved and drove through. That weekend, I got a call from Walter. He said the board had received a letter from Janice's attorney threatening to sue the HOA for defamation and wrongful termination. He said the board attorney had reviewed the letter and advised that it had no merit, because Janice was a volunteer board member, not an employee, and the censure was based on documented misconduct. He said the board was standing by its decision, and he wanted to give me a heads up in case Janice tried to contact me directly. I thanked him and said I would let him know if she did. Janice did not contact me directly, but I heard from neighbors that she was telling people I had fabricated evidence and bribed the city inspector. One neighbor forwarded me a screenshot of the HOA group chat where Janice had posted a long message claiming the board had violated her rights, and I was part of a conspiracy to take over the association. The message was deleted within an hour, and the group admin posted a note saying personal attacks were not allowed, and further violations would result in removal from the chat. 2 weeks later, the HOA held its annual meeting. I attended with Luis, and the room was even more packed than the hearing. The first item on the agenda was the election of new board members. Walter announced that 3 seats were up for election, including Janice's seat, and 5 people had submitted nomination packets. Janice was not one of them. Walter read the names of the candidates, and the membership voted by paper ballot. The results were announced an hour later. All 3 incumbents lost, and 3 new members were elected, including one of the neighbors who had testified at my hearing. The second item on the agenda was a vote on new enforcement policies. The board attorney presented a draft policy that required all violations to be issued in writing with specific rule citations, required a 10-day notice period before fines could be imposed, and prohibited board members from issuing violations without board approval. The policy also created an appeals process with an independent arbitrator and a ban on selective enforcement. The membership voted unanimously to adopt the policy. The final item on the agenda was a motion to ratify the board's censure of Janice. Walter summarized the misconduct findings and the corrective actions, and he opened the floor for discussion. Janice stood up and said the censure was politically motivated and I had manipulated the board into targeting her. She said the board had no authority to strip her of her committee assignments, and she demanded a formal apology and reinstatement. Walter said the censure was based on documented violations of the governing documents, and the board had acted within its authority. He called for a vote, and the membership ratified the censure by a vote of 38-2. After the vote, Janice tried to storm out, But Walter stopped her and said the board needed her to return the thermal printer and the snowblower manual before she left. Janice said she did not have them, and Walter said the board had documentation showing she had checked them out from the management company in November. One of the new board members, a woman in her 40s, stood up and said she had seen Janice using the thermal printer at the hearing, and she asked if Janice wanted her motion on record. Janice glared at her and said she would return the items the next day. She walked out, and the room erupted in applause. I stayed for the rest of the meeting, which included budget discussions and landscaping proposals, but the drama was over. On the way out, several neighbors came up to me and thanked me for standing up to Janice. One man said he had been afraid to challenge her because he did not want to be targeted, and seeing the board hold her accountable gave him hope the association could function properly again. A woman said she had already filed 3 appeals under the new policy for violations Janice had issued last year, and she was confident they would be dismissed. Luis and I stopped at a diner on the way home, and he said it was one of the most satisfying cases he had ever worked on. He said the combination of the police reports, the call logs, the public testimony, and the city letter had made it impossible for the board to ignore the misconduct, and the new enforcement policy would prevent future abuse. I said I was just glad it was over, and I could go back to worrying about normal things like frozen pipes and snowblower maintenance. The written confirmation from the city arrived a few days later. It was a formal letter on inspectional services letterhead, signed by the deputy commissioner, confirming that the HOA had no authority over snow placement on private property, and any fines or liens related to snow storage were unenforceable. The letter also noted that the city had received multiple complaints about Cedar Frost HOA Incorporated over the past year, and the department was monitoring the association for compliance with state law. I scanned the letter and saved it in 3 places: my laptop, my phone, and a USB drive I kept in my truck. The final piece of fallout came a month later. I got a call from the tow vendor, the same guy I had spoken to about the fake tow sticker. He said he had reviewed the call logs and the police reports, and he was terminating his contract with the HOA effective immediately. He said Janice had been calling him after hours and asking him to tow vehicles without proper authorization, and he did not want to be part of a harassment scheme. He also said he was refunding the HOA for any tows that had been disputed, and he was willing to provide a statement if I needed one for a legal case. I thanked him and said I did not think it would be necessary, but I appreciated the integrity. I ran into Janice one more time, about 6 weeks after the annual meeting. I was clearing snow from my driveway after a late-season storm, and she drove past with her window down. She slowed down and yelled, "You think you won, but this is not over." I did not respond. I just kept shoveling. She drove off, and I have not seen her since. The HOA has been quiet since then. The new board has been professional and responsive, and the enforcement policy is working as intended. I have not received any new violations, and the plow crew has stopped pushing berms into my driveway. The management company sent out a notice in March reminding homeowners that all violations must be issued in writing with specific rule citations, and any homeowner who feels they have been targeted can file an appeal with the independent arbitrator at no cost. I also heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Janice tried to run for the board again at the next election, but she withdrew her nomination after several homeowners circulated a petition opposing her candidacy. The petition cited the censure, the harassment findings, and the new enforcement policy, and it collected over 50 signatures in 2 days. Janice posted a response on the group chat saying the petition was defamatory and she was considering legal action. But the post was deleted by the admin, and she was removed from the chat for violating the personal attack policy. Luis and I still meet for coffee every few weeks, and he always asks if I have any new HOA stories. I tell him no, and he says that is a good thing. He also said he has used my case as a teaching example for other clients dealing with HOA overreach, and he has helped 3 people file similar complaints with the Attorney General's office. 2 of those complaints resulted in formal investigations, and 1 HOA was fined for operating without proper bylaws. The city letter is still on my fridge, held up by a magnet shaped like a snow shovel. I look at it every morning when I make coffee, and it reminds me that standing up to bullies is worth the effort, even when the process is exhausting and the stakes feel personal. I also keep the evidence packet in a file box in my closet, just in case Janice decides to make another move, but I do not think she will. She knows I have the receipts, and she knows the board and the membership are done with her nonsense. The neighborhood has slowly returned to normal. The summer pool season went smoothly, with no drama and no surprise rule changes. The new amenities chair is a retired teacher who actually listens to homeowners and schedules events based on feedback. The landscaping looks good, the plow contractor is doing a better job, and the gate keypad was replaced with a newer model that works in freezing fog. I even got a thank you card from the board in December, signed by all 5 members, acknowledging my patience during the enforcement policy transition and thanking me for helping improve the community. I still work as an irrigation tech, and my schedule is still packed year-round. I have learned to avoid HOA politics as much as possible, but I am no longer afraid to push back when something is wrong. I also keep a go bag in my truck with extra copies of the city letter, the police incident numbers, and the board retraction, just in case another Karen decides to test me. So far, no one has. The biggest lesson I learned from this mess is that documentation is everything. If I had not taken photos, saved emails, filed police reports, and kept a timeline, the board would have sided with Janice, and I would have been stuck with hundreds of dollars in fines and a reputation as a problem homeowner. But because I built a solid evidence packet and stayed calm under pressure, I was able to flip the script and force the board to hold Janice accountable. Luis says that is the key to winning any legal fight. Stay organized, stay persistent, and never let the other side control the narrative. I also learned that allies matter. Without Luis helping me organize the evidence and draft the demand letter, I might have given up or made a tactical mistake. Without the neighbors who testified at the hearing, the board might have dismissed my complaints as an isolated dispute. And without the city inspector who confirmed my snow storage was compliant, I would not have had the trump card that ended the fight. Building a coalition and leveraging credible third parties made all the difference. The irony is that Janice's favorite line, "Make it public. I love watching people get embarrassed," came back to haunt her in the most satisfying way possible. She wanted to embarrass me with public violations and staged photos. But instead, she ended up embarrassing herself in front of the entire membership when the board stripped her powers and banned her from contacting homeowners. The board even quoted her boomerang line in the meeting minutes as evidence of her intent to harass. And that detail made it into the official record. The aftermath has been quiet, which is exactly what I wanted. I go to work, I shovel my driveway, I pay my HOA dues, and I mind my own business. The new board sends out newsletters every month with updates on maintenance projects and upcoming events, and the tone is professional and transparent. There are no surprise fines, no midnight tow threats, and no thermal printer ambushes. It is boring, and I love it. I did have one brief scare in February when I got a letter from the management company with the subject line violation notice. My stomach dropped, and I opened it expecting another round of harassment. But it turned out to be a notice that the HOA was conducting a landscaping audit, and all homeowners needed to submit photos of their front yards by the end of the month. The notice was polite, included a specific rule citation, and gave a 10-day deadline with no fines attached. I submitted my photos the next day, and I got a confirmation email thanking me for my cooperation. That is what enforcement should look like. The other homeowners who testified at my hearing have also had positive experiences with the new board. The woman who was fined for leaving her recycling bin out too long filed an appeal and had the fine dismissed within a week. The couple who were cited for the January wreath got a written apology and a refund. The man who had the tow vendor show up at his house at night filed a complaint with the new board, and they voted to add a clause to the enforcement policy banning after-hours enforcement actions, except in genuine emergencies. The changes are real, and they are making a difference. I sometimes wonder what Janice is doing now. I heard she moved to a condo in Quincy and joined the board there, and I feel sorry for those homeowners. But I also know that if she tries the same tactics, someone will eventually push back, and she will end up in the same place, censured, stripped of power, and publicly embarrassed. Bullies like Janice rely on fear and intimidation, and once you take those tools away, they have nothing left. The spring thaw brought new challenges, but they were normal challenges: clogged gutters, muddy walkways, and early landscaping prep. The HOA sent out reminders about spring cleanup deadlines, but the tone was reasonable and the deadlines were realistic. I spent a weekend cleaning out my gutters and trimming the bushes, and I did not get a single violation notice. It felt like living in a normal neighborhood again. I also started attending board meetings regularly, not because I wanted to get involved in HOA politics, but because I wanted to make sure the new policies were being enforced fairly. The meetings are open to all homeowners, and the board encourages public comment. The atmosphere is collaborative, and the board actually listens to concerns instead of dismissing them. It is a stark contrast to the Janice era, and it reminds me why HOAs can be a good thing when they are run by people who care about the community instead of their own power. The new enforcement policy has been tested a few times, and it has held up well. One homeowner was cited for parking a commercial vehicle in a residential spot overnight, and he filed an appeal. The independent arbitrator reviewed the case, confirmed that the vehicle met the definition of commercial under the bylaws, and upheld the violation. But the arbitrator also recommended the board clarify the rule to include examples and provide advance notice before issuing fines, and the board adopted both recommendations. That is how enforcement should work: fair, transparent, and focused on education rather than punishment. I ran into Walter at the hardware store a few months ago, and he thanked me again for standing up to Janice. He said the board had received positive feedback from homeowners about the new policies, and the association's reputation had improved significantly. He also said the management company had reported a drop in complaint calls and a rise in dues compliance, which he attributed to the more professional enforcement approach. I told him I appreciated the board's willingness to make changes, and he said it was a team effort. The Attorney General complaint was closed in May with a finding that the HOA had taken appropriate corrective action, and no further investigation was warranted. The letter from the AG's office noted that the new enforcement policy was consistent with state law, and the board's response to the misconduct findings demonstrated a commitment to transparency and accountability. I saved the letter with the rest of my evidence packet, and I sent a copy to Luis for his files. The tow vendor's decision to terminate his contract with the HOA also had ripple effects. The new board put out a request for proposals from other tow companies, and they selected a vendor with a strong reputation for following proper procedures and requiring written authorization for every tow. The new contract includes a clause prohibiting after-hours tows except in emergencies, and it requires the vendor to provide a copy of the authorization to the homeowner before towing. Those protections would have prevented most of the harassment I experienced, and I am glad the board learned from the mistakes. I also learned that Janice's relationship with the old tow vendor was closer than I thought. One of the neighbors who testified at my hearing did some digging and found out that Janice's brother-in-law was a dispatcher for the tow company, and several of the after-hours calls had come from his personal phone. The neighbor shared that information with the board, and the board forwarded it to the management company and the new tow vendor as part of the contract transition. I do not know if anything came of it, but it explains why Janice was so aggressive about pushing tows, and why the vendor was willing to bend the rules. The final closure came in June when I received a settlement check from the HOA for $300. The check was accompanied by a letter from the board attorney explaining that the board had voted to reimburse me for the costs I incurred defending against the violations, including the police reports, the paralegal fees, and the time I spent preparing evidence. The letter also said the board wanted to acknowledge my patience and professionalism during the enforcement policy transition, and they hoped the settlement would help restore trust. I deposited the check and sent a thank you note to Walter and the board. The neighborhood is quiet now, in the best way possible. The summer cookouts are back, the kids are playing in the pool, and the HOA is doing what it is supposed to do: maintaining common areas, organizing events, and staying out of people's way. I still see some of the neighbors who testified at my hearing, and we have a mutual understanding that we stood up to something wrong and made the community better. That is worth more than any settlement check. I have also become something of a resource for other homeowners dealing with HOA issues. A few people have reached out to me for advice on how to document violations, how to file appeals, and how to build an evidence packet. I always tell them the same thing Luis told me: stay organized, stay persistent, and never let the other side control the narrative. I also tell them to get everything in writing, to involve third parties like the police or city inspectors when possible, and to find an ally who can help them navigate the process. Those strategies worked for me, and I hope they work for others. The snowblower manual that Janice used as a prop during the harassment campaign was eventually returned to the management company, along with the thermal printer. The new board voted to retire the thermal printer and to stop issuing paper violations on site. And all violations are now sent via email with a tracking number and a copy to the management company. The snowblower manual was added to the community library in the clubhouse, where it belongs. The measuring tape that I used to prove my snow pile was compliant is still in my garage, and I keep it in my go bag along with the city letter and the police incident numbers. I have not needed it since the Janice era ended, but I am glad I have it. You never know when someone will try to pull the same stunt, and I want to be ready. The final irony is that Janice's own catchphrase, "Keep talking, I love adding notes," became a running joke in the neighborhood. At the next annual meeting, someone made t-shirts with that phrase on the front and the HOA logo on the back, and about a dozen people wore them as a statement. The board took it in stride, and Walter even joked during his opening remarks that the new enforcement policy had a lot of notes, and he hoped everyone appreciated them. The room laughed, and it felt like a symbolic end to the Janice era. I still work as an irrigation tech, I still live in the same townhouse, and I still shovel my driveway every winter. But now, when I look at my snow pile, I do not worry about staged photos or fake violations. I just see snow, and I move on with my day. That is what normal feels like, and I am grateful for it. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.